Blood is thicker than water, or so the old proverb goes. But what people rarely tell you is that blood can also drown you. I spent 18 years rotting in a state-run orphanage, believing I was entirely alone in the world, abandoned by a family that simply couldn't be bothered to love me. Then, my estranged grandmother died. She was a woman I had seen exactly 3 times in my entire life, always from behind a veil of cold indifference. I didn't expect a single dime from her multi-million-dollar estate. I certainly didn't expect a high-powered corporate lawyer to pull up to the cracked gravel driveway of Street Jude's children's home, carrying a velvet box, a cryptic letter, and a heavy brass key that would unlock a terrifying string of family secrets I was never meant to discover. Rain lashed against the single-pane windows of Street Jude's home for children, a dilapidated brick building situated on the dreary outskirts of Portland, Oregon. I was 18. Just weeks away from aging out of the system, sitting on a sagging twin mattress and packing my meager belongings into a duffel bag. My name is Clara Hayes. For as long as I could remember, my universe had been confined to peeling wallpaper, the sharp scent of industrial bleach, and the rigid, unforgiving rules of the orphanage director, Mrs. Harriet Gable. I was technically an orphan, but my situation was a complicated shade of grey. My parents, David and Rachel Hayes, died in a tragic car accident when I was barely a year old. Instead of being taken in by my mother's mother, the formidable, notoriously wealthy Beatrice Kensington, I was dumped into the foster care system, eventually landing permanently at Street Jude's. Beatrice was a titan in the Pacific Northwest, the ruthlessly successful founder of Kensington Real Estate Holdings. She lived less than 20 miles away in a sprawling estate in Lake Oswego, yet she allowed her only granddaughter to grow up wearing donated clothes and eating powdered eggs. She visited me exactly 3 times. Once when I was 7, once when I was 12, and finally, on my 16th birthday. Each visit was identical. She would arrive in a sleek black town car, sit stiffly in Mrs. Gable's cramped office, and stare at me with pale, icy blue eyes that held absolutely no affection. She wore suffocatingly strong Chanel No. 5, draped herself in cashmere, and asked me sterile questions about my grades. She never brought a gift. She never hugged me. After exactly 15 minutes, she would stand up, smooth her skirt, and leave. When the news of her death reached me, I felt nothing. No grief, no sudden sense of loss. Beatrice Kensington, aged 82, had succumbed to heart failure in her sleep. I read about it in the local newspaper that Mrs. Gable had left on the kitchen island. The article detailed her vast empire, her philanthropic donations to the local arts, and vaguely mentioned she was survived by no immediate family. That sting of public erasure was the only thing that managed to pierce my thick skin. To the world, I didn't even exist. The reading of her will took place on a Tuesday. I knew this because a heavily perfumed envelope had arrived at the orphanage, addressed to me, informing me of the date and time. It was a formality, of course. I didn't go. I had a shift at the local diner washing dishes, and I wasn't about to lose an hour's wage to sit in a room full of greedy sycophants, waiting for a slice of Beatrice's pie, only to be publicly handed absolutely nothing. I assumed she had left everything to her precious arts foundations or perhaps a pampered, purebred dog. But the universe, as I was about to learn, has a twisted sense of humor. It was Thursday afternoon when the black Mercedes pulled into the gravel driveway of Street Jude's. I was in the front yard, pulling weeds from the overgrown flower beds, one of Mrs. Gable's favorite punishments for minor infractions, which in my case was leaving a damp towel on my bed. I wiped the dirt from my forehead with the back of my wrist, watching as a tall, impeccably dressed man stepped out of the vehicle. He looked entirely out of place against the backdrop of our rusting swing set and rotting porch. He adjusted his tie, his gaze sweeping over the depressing facade of the orphanage before locking onto me. "I am looking for Clara Hayes," he said. His voice was smooth, practiced, and held the kind of authority that commanded instant obedience. I stood up, brushing the damp Portland soil from my worn-out jeans. "You found her." The man's eyes flickered with a brief, unreadable emotion, perhaps pity, perhaps surprise, before returning to a professional neutrality. He reached into his leather briefcase. "My name is Nathaniel George. I am the senior partner at George and Associates, and the executor of the estate of the late Beatrice Kensington. We need to have a conversation, Miss Hayes." Somewhere private, a heavy knot formed in my stomach. Why was a senior partner of a high-end law firm hand-delivering something to a forgotten granddaughter? I nodded slowly and led him up the creaking wooden steps toward Mrs. Gable's office. Mrs. Harriet Gable was a severe woman who wore her hair in a tight, uncompromising bun and viewed every child in her care as a potential liability. When I knocked on her office door and walked in with Nathaniel George trailing behind me, she nearly dropped her teacup. "Miss Hayes, what is the meaning of this?" Mrs. Gable snapped, her eyes darting nervously to Nathaniel's expensive suit. "Mrs. Gable," Nathaniel intervened smoothly, stepping past me. "I am Nathaniel George. I represent the estate of Beatrice Kensington. I require use of your office to speak with my client. Alone." Mrs. Gable's face flushed a deep, mottled red. She knew exactly who Beatrice Kensington was. Everyone in Street Jude's did. The unsaid truth had always hung over my head. I was the poor orphan whose grandmother was a millionaire. "Of course," she stammered, gathering her papers with uncharacteristic clumsiness. "Take all the time you need." As the door clicked shut behind her, Nathaniel gestured for me to sit in the rickety wooden chair opposite the desk. He remained standing, placing his leather briefcase gently on Mrs. Gable's scratched mahogany desk. "I imagine you are wondering why I am here, Clara," Nathaniel began, unlocking the clasps of his briefcase with a sharp snap. "I assume my grandmother left me a very nice framed photograph of herself," I replied, my voice dripping with sarcasm. "Or maybe a coupon for a discount at one of her shopping malls." Nathaniel did not smile. "Your grandmother was a complex woman, Miss Hayes. Her will was unconventional. As you know, her estate is valued at roughly $45 million. The entirety of her liquid assets, her real estate portfolio, and her holding companies have been placed into an irrevocable, blind trust." "Good for her," I said, crossing my arms. "So why are you here?" Nathaniel reached into the briefcase and pulled out 2 items. A thick, sealed envelope made of heavy parchment paper and a small, worn velvet jewelry box. He slid them across the desk toward me. "Because," Nathaniel said quietly, "she left these specifically for you, outside of the trust, to be delivered by me, personally, no later than 48 hours after the reading of the will." I stared at the items. My hands were trembling slightly, though I tried to hide it. I reached for the velvet box first. The hinges squeaked as I opened it. Inside, resting on faded silk, was not a diamond ring or a pearl necklace. It was a key. It was heavy, made of tarnished brass, with intricate, old-fashioned teeth. The head of the key was engraved with a series of numbers. 402. B. It looked like something that belonged in the 19th century, not modern-day Portland. "A key?" I asked, looking up at him in confusion. "To what?" "A safety deposit box," Nathaniel replied. "At First Pacific Trust on 5th Avenue, downtown. Box number 402B. I frowned, picking up the key. It felt unnaturally cold against my palm. "What's in the box, Mr. George?" "I don't know," Nathaniel said, and for the first time, I detected a hint of genuine unease in his polished demeanor. "Your grandmother was highly secretive about it. She paid the lease on that box 50 years in advance. But there is a stipulation, Clara. A rather significant one," I scoffed. "With Beatrice, there's always a catch. To access the box, you must present the key. However, the lease agreement mandates a dual signature for entry. You cannot open it alone." "Okay," I said, exasperated. "Who is the other signature?" That is the complication. The cosigner listed on the account is a man named Richard Sterling. The name meant absolutely nothing to me. Who is Richard Sterling? Nathaniel sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose. We don't entirely know. I ran a preliminary trace when I saw the stipulation in the private addendum. Richard Sterling has no current fixed address, no recent tax records, and seems to have fallen off the grid approximately 15 years ago. But Beatrice was adamant. If you want whatever is in that box, you must open it with him. I looked down at the parchment envelope. My name was written across the front, in Beatrice's sharp, spidery handwriting. I broke the wax seal and pulled out the single sheet of thick cotton paper. Clara, if you are reading this, I am dead, and you are likely angry. You have spent your life believing I abandoned you to that wretched place out of cruelty. The truth is far more dangerous. I kept you in the dark to keep you alive. The empire I built is steeped in blood, Clara. Your father's blood, and soon, perhaps mine. Inside box 402B is the truth. It is your real inheritance. But to claim it, you must find Richard. Do not trust George. Do not trust the police. And above all, Clara, do not trust Harriet Gable. Forgive me, Beatrice. My breath caught in my throat. I read the letter again, my eyes snagging on the last line. Do not trust Harriet Gable. Mrs. Gable, the miserable woman who ran the orphanage. What could she possibly have to do with my multimillionaire grandmother? And more disturbingly, Beatrice was telling me not to trust the very lawyer sitting across from me. I quickly folded the letter and slipped it into my pocket, keeping my face as blank as possible. What does it say? Nathaniel asked, his eyes narrowing slightly as he watched me conceal the paper. Nothing important, I lied smoothly. Just a final insult from the grave, telling me to make something of myself. Nathaniel looked as though he didn't believe me for a second, but he nodded. Very well. As the executor, my duty is complete by handing you the key. However, if you need the resources of George and Associates to locate Mr. Sterling, I'll handle it. I interrupted, standing up and clutching the brass key tightly in my fist. Thank you, Mr. George. You can show yourself out. As Nathaniel left the room, his expensive leather shoes clicking against the linoleum, I realized my life was no longer my own. The quiet, miserable existence I had planned for myself had just been obliterated by a dead woman's brass key. I didn't wait. The moment my shift at the diner was over the next morning, I took the 1-4 line bus straight into downtown Portland. The city was weeping its usual misty rain, casting a grey, oppressive filter over the towering glass skyscrapers. First Pacific Trust stood like a fortress among them, a grand, imposing structure of granite and marble that looked like it had been transported straight from the 1920s. I walked through the heavy revolving doors, acutely aware of how out of place I looked in my scuffed combat boots, faded black jeans, and an oversized flannel shirt. The bank was hushed, smelling of floor wax and old money. I approached the polished mahogany front desk. A sharply dressed teller looked down her nose at me. Can I help you, miss? I need to access safety deposit box 402B, I said, placing the heavy brass key onto the marble counter. The teller's eyes widened slightly at the sight of the key. One moment, please. She picked up a telephone, whispered something urgently, and within 2 minutes, a balding man in a tailored charcoal suit hurried over. Miss Hayes, I presume? He asked, extending a soft, manicured hand. I am Mr. Harrison, the vault manager. We received a notice from the George firm that you might be coming. Please, follow me. He led me past the teller stations, through a heavy steel gate, and down a spiraling carpeted staircase into the subterranean levels of the bank. The air down here was cooler, climate-controlled, and sterile. We approached a massive circular steel vault door that looked like it belonged on a submarine. Box 402B is in our legacy wing, Mr. Harrison explained, his voice echoing slightly in the corridor. However, As Mr. George likely informed you, there is a strict dual signature requirement. I cannot allow you to access the box without the presence of the co-signer, Mr. Richard Sterling. I swallowed hard. I know. I'm just here to see the box. To figure out. You won't have to figure anything out. A gruff, gravelly voice echoed from the shadows of the vault corridor. I spun around. Leaning against a marble pillar was a man who looked like he had been chewed up and spat out by the world. He appeared to be in his late 50s, wearing a weathered leather jacket, faded jeans, and scuffed boots. His face was lined with deep, harsh wrinkles, and he had a thick, unkempt grey beard. But it was his eyes that caught me. They were piercing, icy blue, the exact same eyes as Beatrice Kensington. Mr. Harrison didn't look surprised. "Ah, Mr. Sterling, you've been waiting for 3 hours. I'm glad Miss Hayes finally arrived." I took a step back, my heart hammering against my ribs. "You're Richard Sterling?" The man nodded slowly, pushing himself off the pillar. He walked toward me with a slight limp. "Your grandmother said you had her stubborn chin. She wasn't wrong. How did you know I would be here today?" I demanded, my hand instinctively going to my pocket where Beatrice's letter was hidden. "Nathaniel George said you were off the grid, that you couldn't be found." Richard let out a dry, humorless chuckle. "Nathaniel George is a corporate snake who knows exactly as much as Beatrice wanted him to know. I'm off the grid because I choose to be. Beatrice sent me a telegram 3 days before she died. She told me the clock was ticking, and to wait for you here." "Who are you?" I asked, my voice trembling slightly. Richard looked at me, a profound sadness settling into his icy eyes. "I'm the man who was supposed to raise you, Clara. I'm your mother's brother, your uncle." The ground felt like it was shifting beneath my feet. My mother didn't have a brother. At least, that's what my file at St. Jude's said. My file said she was an only child. "We can do the family reunion later," Richard said, turning to Mr. Harrison. "Let's open the damn box." Mr. Harrison cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable with the tension, and led us down a long, narrow aisle of stainless steel boxes. He stopped at a large rectangular door near the bottom. 402B. "Your key, Miss Hayes," Mr. Harrison requested. I handed it to him. He inserted it into the right-hand lock. Richard reached into his leather jacket, pulled out an identical brass key, and handed it over. Mr. Harrison inserted it into the left-hand lock. He turned them simultaneously. With a heavy, satisfying clunk, the locks disengaged. Mr. Harrison pulled the metal drawer out, set it on a nearby viewing table, and discreetly bowed out of the room. "I will leave you to your privacy." I stared at the dark metal box. Richard stood beside me, his jaw clenched tight. "Go ahead, Clara. It's yours." With shaking hands, I lifted the lid. I had expected money. I had expected jewels, or perhaps more letters. Instead, the box was filled to the brim with yellowing, ancient-looking documents. I reached in and pulled out the top stack. It was a thick bundle of property deeds, held together by a brittle rubber band. I slid the top document out and read the bold print at the top. "Deed of ownership. 4450 Westridge Drive, Multnomah County." I frowned. Westridge Drive. Wait. That's the address for St. Jude's. "Keep reading," Richard urged quietly. I scanned down the page to the property owner line. It didn't list the state of Oregon. It didn't list the Catholic Church. It read, "Beatrice Kensington. My grandmother owned the orphanage?" I gasped, the air rushing out of my lungs. "She owned the building I was trapped in for 18 years? "She didn't just own the building, Clara," Richard said, reaching into the box and pulling out a leather-bound ledger. He opened it and pointed to a column of meticulously recorded bank transfers. "She funded the entire operation, millions of dollars over the last 2 decades, funneled through shell corporations." "Why?" I demanded, feeling sick to my stomach. Why would she do that? Why would she leave me there to rot, eating garbage and wearing rags, if she owned the place? Richard slammed the ledger shut, the sound echoing violently in the quiet vault. Because it wasn't an orphanage, Clara. Not really. Look at the rest of the documents. I dug frantically into the box. Beneath the deeds were birth certificates, dozens of them. I started flipping through them. Michael Vance, Rachel Jenkins, Leo Torres. I recognized these names. They were the kids I grew up with. The kids who, like me, never seemed to get adopted. The lifers of Street Judes. What is this? I whispered, a cold sweat breaking out on the back of my neck. Street Judes was a holding facility, Richard said, his voice dropping to a grim whisper. Beatrice didn't put you there to punish you. She put you there to hide you. Every single child in that building is the illegitimate offspring, the hidden heir, or the discarded bloodline of the wealthiest, most dangerous families in the Pacific Northwest. Beatrice gathered you all up and created a fortress masquerading as a slum. I stumbled back, leaning against the cold steel of the deposit boxes. My entire life, the misery, the isolation, Mrs. Gable's cruelty was a carefully constructed lie. And Mrs. Gable? I managed to ask, remembering the chilling warning in Beatrice's letter. Richard's eyes darkened. Harriet Gable isn't a social worker. Clara, she's a warden. And she's been on the payroll of the very people Beatrice was trying to hide you from. Now that Beatrice is dead, the protection is gone. Mrs. Gable is going to sell every single one of you out. The silence in the subterranean vault of First Pacific Trust was deafening. I stared at the yellowing birth certificates scattered across the polished metal table, the names of the kids I had grown up with blurring together through unshed tears. My entire reality had been dismantled in the span of 5 minutes. My parents, I whispered, the words catching like broken glass in my throat. The car accident. Was it? Richard sighed, running a calloused hand over his face. He looked 10 years older than he had when he first stepped out of the shadows. It wasn't an accident, Clara. Your father, David, was Beatrice's golden boy, the heir to the Kensington Empire. Your mother, Rachel, was my sister. The Sterlings and the Kensingtons practically owned the Portland real estate market, but they were vicious rivals. When David and Rachel fell in love and ran away to get married, it started a corporate war. I gripped the edge of the viewing table, my knuckles turning white. So they were murdered over real estate? They were murdered over leverage, Richard corrected, his voice hardening. When your mother got pregnant with you, both families panicked. A child bridging the two empires meant a consolidation of power that the board members and rival stakeholders wouldn't tolerate. Your parents found out there was a hit put out on them. They tried to run to Canada. Their brakes were cut on Interstate 5 just south of Seattle. A cold, hollow numbness spread through my chest. And you? Where were you? I was supposed to be in the car with them, Richard said, his gaze dropping to the floor. I got delayed. After they died, Beatrice realized the people who ordered the hit were still looking for you. If she took you in and raised you at the Kensington estate, you'd be a sitting duck, a target every time you walked out the front doors. So she bought a rotting building on Westridge Drive, bribed the state foster system, and locked me in a cage, I said bitterly. And she did the same for the other kids? Exactly. Richard nodded, tapping the thick leather ledger. Over the years, whenever she found a child of a powerful family who was in danger, illegitimate heirs, kids targeted by corporate rivals, kids whose parents had been silenced, she funneled them into Street Judes. It became a black site for the billionaire class, a place where the unwanted liabilities were kept alive, but entirely off the grid. I looked down at the deed to Street Judes. But she's dead now. The protection is gone, and the wolves are at the door, Richard confirmed grimly. He began rapidly shoving the deeds, the birth certificates, and the ledger back into the metal deposit box. Harriet Gable has been running the day-to-day operations for 15 years. She's ruthless. But she was terrified of Beatrice. With Beatrice gone, Gable is looking at a gold mine. She has a building full of high-value targets, and the very people who want those kids erased are willing to pay millions to find them. Panic, sharp and icy, finally pierced through my shock. Leo, Rachel, the little kids. Gable is going to sell them out. She probably already started, Richard said, snapping the lid of the box shut and tucking it securely under his arm. Nathaniel George didn't come to the orphanage just to give you a key, Clara. He went there to verify that the asset you were still on the premises and to signal to Gable that the boss was dead. We have to go back, I said, my voice trembling but resolute. Right now. We are, Richard said, grabbing my elbow and steering me toward the heavy steel door. But we have to be smart. If Gable knows you have the deed and the ledger, she'll kill us both and claim we ran away. We are walking into a hostage situation. We hurried out of the vault, bypassing Mr. Harrison entirely, and practically sprinted up the spiraling carpeted staircase. As we burst through the revolving glass doors of the bank and out onto the rain-slicked pavement of Fifth Avenue, Richard suddenly yanked me backward by the collar of my flannel shirt, pulling me behind a thick concrete pillar. What are you? Quiet, he hissed. Peering around the edge of the concrete, I followed his gaze. Parked illegally in the loading zone directly across the street was a black, heavily tinted SUV. It hadn't been there when I arrived. As I watched, the driver's side window rolled down an inch, and I saw the distinct, polished profile of Nathaniel George talking on a cell phone. George, I breathed. He's waiting to see if you walk out of here with the box, Richard said. He looked around frantically, his eyes locking onto a narrow, trash-filled alleyway connected to the side of the bank. Come on. My truck is parked 3 blocks down near the Burnside Bridge. Keep your head down. We slipped into the alley, the smell of damp cardboard and stale beer hitting my nose. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. 18 years of believing I was nobody, a discarded piece of trash. And now I was running from corporate fixers, with a multi-million-dollar ledger tucked under my uncle's arm. The irony was suffocating. The drive back to the outskirts of Portland was agonizingly slow. Richard's vehicle was a rusted, beat-up 1998 Ford F-150 that rattled violently whenever he pushed it past 50 miles per hour. The rain had intensified into a torrential downpour, turning the winding roads leading up to Westridge Drive into slick ribbons of black glass. I spent the ride flipping through the leather ledger in the dim glow of the dashboard lights. The scope of Beatrice's operation was terrifying. There were detailed logs of wire transfers to judges, child welfare administrators, and local politicians. It was a massive, airtight conspiracy designed to keep Street Judes completely immune from state inspections or audits. She paid off everyone, I muttered, tracing a line item that showed a $50,000 donation to a local police commissioner. It's the only way she could keep the state from looking too closely at the adoption records, Richard said, keeping his eyes glued to the road. None of you were ever legally allowed to be adopted. Gable's job was to make Street Judes look so unappealing, and the children so troubled, that prospective parents never looked twice. She did a great job, I said dryly, remembering the times Mrs. Gable had purposely sabotaged the few meet and greets I had by telling couples I was prone to violent outbursts and stealing. It was nearly 9:00 p.m. when we finally turned onto the cracked gravel driveway of Street Judes. The towering brick building loomed against the stormy sky like a haunted asylum. The porch lights were off, which was a direct violation of Mrs. Gable's strict curfew protocols. Something's wrong, I whispered, the hairs on my arms standing up. The perimeter lights are off. Richard killed the headlights of the truck and parked it out of sight behind a thick cluster of overgrown Douglas fir trees near the edge of the property. He reached under his seat and pulled out a heavy, matte black flashlight and something wrapped in a greasy rag. When he unwrapped it, The ambient light caught the steel barrel of a revolver. I stared at the gun, my stomach doing a slow, nauseating flip. Is that really necessary? I hope not, Richard replied grimly, tucking the weapon into the waistband of his jeans and pulling his leather jacket over it. Stay behind me. We used the kitchen entrance. What show? Show. We moved quickly through the heavy rain, our boots sinking into the muddy lawn. We reached the back of the building. The heavy steel door leading into the industrial kitchen was usually deadbolted from the inside at 7:00 p.m. sharp. I reached out and turned the handle. It clicked, and the door swung inward with a faint squeal. Unlocked, I mouthed to Richard. He nodded, pushing past me and stepping into the dark, cavernous kitchen. The smell of boiled cabbage and bleach was overpowering. We crept through the kitchen and into the main dining hall. The long cafeteria tables were empty, but there was a strange, chaotic mess left behind. Trays were overturned. A chair was broken in the corner, and a solitary blue sneaker belonging to a 10-year-old boy named Toby lay abandoned in the center of the linoleum floor. My breath caught. There was a struggle here. Quiet, Richard hissed, holding up a hand. From down the long, shadowed hallway that led to the administrative offices, we heard voices. They were muffled, but one of them was unmistakably the sharp, nasal tone of Mrs. Harriet Gable. We pressed ourselves against the peeling wallpaper and inched our way down the corridor. As we neared her office, the heavy oak door was slightly ajar, casting a slice of yellow light across the dark hallway. I don't care about the weather, Donovan. Mrs. Gable was snapping. The old bat is dead. The trust is frozen, which means my payroll is frozen. I am not running a charity out of the goodness of my heart. I peeked through the crack in the door. Mrs. Gable was standing behind her desk, wearing a sharp grey pantsuit, her severe bun looking slightly frazzled. Standing opposite her were two large, imposing men in tactical gear. They didn't look like lawyers. They looked like mercenaries. We have the transport vans out back. Mrs. Gable, one of the men, presumably Donovan, rumbled. My employer has authorized the wire transfer, 10 million for the 3 primary assets. The Torres boy, the Jenkins girl, and the Hayes girl. My blood ran cold. The Hayes girl. Me. You can have Torres and Jenkins, Gable said dismissively, waving a manicured hand. They are locked in the basement, holding cells right now. But Clara Hayes isn't here. Donovan stepped forward, towering over the desk. Our intelligence says she was here yesterday. Where is she? She left this morning. Gable lied smoothly, though I could see a bead of sweat on her forehead. She had a meeting downtown, but she'll be back. She has nowhere else to go. Take the other 2 now, and I will contact you the second she walks through the front door. 10 million is for all 3, Donovan growled, resting his hand on the holster at his hip. If we leave without the Kensington air, the deal is off, and we clean the house. No witnesses. Gable's face paled. She had overplayed her hand. She thought she could sell us piecemeal, but she was dealing with monsters who didn't negotiate. Richard looked down at me, his icy blue eyes hard. He slowly drew the revolver from his waistband. We can't let them take Leo and Rachel, I whispered, panic tearing at my throat. They're just kids. We aren't letting them take anyone, Richard whispered back. He handed me the heavy leather ledger. Hold this. When I move, you get to the basement and get the kids out. Use the storm doors to escape. What about you? I'm going to have a little chat with the warden, Richard said, a terrifying, predatory smile crossing his face. Before I could protest, Richard kicked the heavy oak door. It flew open with a deafening crack, slamming into the wall. Evening. Harriet. Richard roared, stepping into the room and raising the revolver. I hear you're having a fire sale on my family. The room erupted into chaos. Donovan shouted, reaching for his weapon, while Mrs. Gable let out a piercing shriek, diving behind her mahogany desk. "Run, Clara!" Richard bellowed over the noise. I didn't hesitate, clutching the ledger of Beatrice Kensington's sins to my chest. I spun around and sprinted down the dark hallway toward the basement doors, praying I wouldn't be too late to save the only family I had ever really known. Gunfire shattered the oppressive silence of Street Jude's, a deafening, percussive boom that vibrated through the peeling wallpaper and rattled my teeth. It was followed instantly by a barrage of suppressed, rapid-fire clicks and the sound of breaking glass. I didn't stop running. My combat boots slipped frantically on the worn linoleum as I rounded the corner toward the administrative wing's rear stairwell. My chest heaved, lungs burning with the sharp scent of ozone and fear. The heavy, leather-bound ledger, the key to a multi-million-dollar conspiracy, and the proof of my true identity was pressed so tightly against my ribs, it felt like a bulletproof vest. The door to the basement was at the end of the hall, usually secured by a heavy brass padlock. Tonight, the padlock lay discarded on the floor, its hasp cut clean through by bolt cutters. I threw my weight against the door, slipping into the stifling darkness of the stairwell, the basement of Street. Jude's had originally been a coal cellar in the 1920s, before being converted into a sprawling, concrete labyrinth of boiler rooms and dry storage. I knew it intimately. When Mrs. Gable wanted to punish us without leaving marks, she sent us down here to scrub the sprawling network of exposed steam pipes. I crept down the wooden stairs, my breathing loud in my own ears. Above me, another crash echoed from the first floor, followed by a man's agonizing shout. "Please, let Richard be alive," I prayed silently, gripping the wooden handrail. At the bottom of the stairs, the narrow corridor was illuminated by a single flickering fluorescent bulb. The air was thick, smelling of rust, damp earth, and industrial cleaner. I pressed my back against the cold cinder-block wall and edged toward the old cold storage room at the far end of the hall. Mrs. Gable had retrofitted it years ago with a heavy steel security door, claiming it was to keep raccoons out of the emergency rations. Now, I knew exactly what it was meant to hold. Standing in front of the reinforced door was a second mercenary. He was younger than Donovan, built like a linebacker, and dressed in the same matte black tactical gear. He held a suppressed submachine gun casually across his chest, his eyes scanning the dark hallway. He looked bored, casually chewing a piece of gum as if he weren't guarding stolen children destined for the slaughterhouse. Panic seized my throat. I had no weapon. I had no training. I was an 18-year-old girl who washed dishes at a diner for minimum wage. How was I supposed to get past a professional killer? I looked around, frantically. To my left, set back in a shallow alcove, was the primary boiler room. The door was slightly ajar. I slipped inside, my eyes adjusting to the dim light bleeding in from the hallway. Racks of rusted tools lined the walls. I grabbed the heaviest thing I could find, a massive, cast-iron pipe wrench that weighed at least 10 pounds. But swinging a wrench wouldn't stop a bullet. I needed an advantage. My gaze fell on a tall, red cylinder mounted near the furnace, an industrial, dry, chemical fire extinguisher. An idea formed desperate, reckless, and entirely my grandmother's style. I set the ledger down on a dusty workbench, unhooked the extinguisher, and pulled the metal safety pin. Hefting the heavy canister in my left hand and the iron wrench in my right, I crept back to the doorway. I took a deep breath, stepped out of the alcove, and kicked a loose bucket across the concrete floor. The metal clattered loudly. The guard whipped around, raising his weapon toward the noise. Before he could pull the trigger, I squeezed the lever of the fire extinguisher. A violent, roaring geyser of thick, white chemical foam erupted from the nozzle, filling the narrow corridor in an instant. The cloud hit the mercenary directly in the face, blinding him and choking the air from his lungs. He coughed violently, firing a blind, suppressed burst into the ceiling. Plaster rained down on my shoulders. I dropped the extinguisher, lunged forward through the suffocating white cloud, and swung the iron wrench with every ounce of strength I possessed. The heavy metal connected with the side of his tactical helmet, With a sickening crack, the man crumpled to the floor, his weapon clattering across the concrete. I stood over him, my hands shaking so violently, I nearly dropped the wrench. I didn't wait to see if he was breathing. I sprinted to the steel door. It was secured by a heavy sliding deadbolt. I threw the bolt back and yanked the heavy door open. "Leo? Rachel?" I called out, coughing through the lingering chemical dust. The room was pitch black, smelling of fear and unwashed clothes. From the corner, a small, trembling voice answered. "Clara?" I fumbled for the light switch on the wall and flipped it. Huddled in the corner, on a single, filthy mattress were 12-year-old Leo Torres and 8-year-old Rachel Jenkins. Rachel was crying silently, her face buried in Leo's shoulder. Leo looked up at me, his dark eyes wide with terror, holding a broken piece of a broom handle like a spear. "Clara, what's happening?" Leo whispered, his voice cracking. "Mrs. Gable locked us down here hours ago. She said some men were coming to take us to a new home." "She lied," I said, my voice surprisingly steady. The maternal instinct to protect them completely overrode my own terror. I dropped the wrench and rushed over to them, pulling them both into a tight hug. "We are leaving. Right now. Are you both okay?" Rachel nodded against my chest. "I'm scared." There was loud noises upstairs. "I know, sweetie. But we have to be brave for just a few more minutes," I said, pulling back and looking Leo dead in the eye. "Leo, I need you to hold Rachel's hand and not let go. No matter what you see or hear, you follow me. Do you understand?" Leo swallowed hard and nodded, dropping the piece of wood and grabbing Rachel's small hand. "Good," I said. I darted out of the room, retrieved the leather ledger from the boiler room, and led the kids toward the opposite end of the basement. I knew there was a set of slanted wooden storm doors that opened directly into the backyard, leading toward the tree line, where Richard had hidden the truck. I pushed the heavy wooden bar off the storm doors and shoved them open. Pouring rain instantly lashed against our faces, a freezing, chaotic baptism into our new reality. "Run," I ordered, pushing them up the concrete steps and out into the muddy grass. Straight toward the trees. The storm was unrelenting. Thunder rattled the bones of the earth as I dragged Leo and Rachel through the knee-high, soaking wet weeds of Street Jude's backyard. The mud sucked at our shoes, threatening to pull us down into the darkness. We reached the thick cluster of Douglas firs near the perimeter fence. Richard's rusted Ford F-150 was right where we left it, cloaked in shadows. I threw the passenger door open, hoisted Rachel into the cab, and pushed Leo in after her. "Stay on the floorboards," I commanded, slamming the door shut. I pressed my back against the wet metal of the truck, the heavy ledger shielded under my jacket, and stared back at the imposing silhouette of the orphanage. The building was dark, save for the single light still burning in Mrs. Gable's office. There were no sirens, no police, just the sound of the rain and my own ragged breathing. 10 minutes passed, an eternity of agonizing silence. If Richard was dead, I had no keys to the truck. I had no money. I had 2 terrified children, a ledger full of billionaires' secrets, and a target painted on my back. Suddenly, a shadow detached itself from the back porch of the orphanage. A figure stumbled out into the rain, clutching his side, walking with a heavy, agonizing limp. "Richard!" I gasped, breaking from the cover of the truck and running toward him. As I got closer, the faint ambient light caught the slick, dark stain spreading across the left side of his leather jacket. He was breathing in shallow, ragged gasps, his face deathly pale. He still had the revolver gripped tightly in his right hand. "I'm fine," he grunted, though he heavily leaned his weight against me as I slung his arm over my shoulder. "Just a graze," from Donovan's sidearm. "Did you get the kids?" "They're in the truck," I said, practically dragging him the rest of the way. "What happened in the office? Is Mrs. Gable dead?" Richard spat, the word carrying no sympathy. When I kicked the door in, Donovan didn't even aim at me first. He shot Harriet right in the chest. She was a liability. She knew too much about the buyers. He was cleaning house. A shiver of pure horror ran down my spine. The woman who had tormented me for 18 years was gone, executed like a pawn on a chessboard. And Donovan? I put 2 rounds in his sternum, Richard said grimly as we reached the truck. He leaned against the driver's side door, coughing a wet, painful sound. But before he bled out, he was laughing. Clara. He told me I was too late. He told me who actually signed the wire transfer for the hit. Who? I asked, my grip tightening on the ledger. Which family? The Kensingtons? The Sterlings? Richard looked at me, his icy blue eyes hardened by betrayal. Neither. It was Nathaniel George. George? I repeated, stunned. My grandmother's lawyer? Why would he want us dead? He's the executor of the trust. Exactly. Richard sneered, pulling a set of blood-slicked keys from his pocket and unlocking the truck. He's not just a lawyer, Clara. George is the architect of the new regime. Beatrice's will stipulates that if you, the sole blood heir, cannot be located or are proven deceased, the entirety of the $45 million estate, including the blind trust, defaults to a charitable foundation. He paused, opening the driver's door. A foundation entirely managed by the board of directors at George and Associates. They get the money, the land, everything. George didn't come to the orphanage to give you a key out of duty. He came to confirm your face, so his mercenaries wouldn't hit the wrong girl. I stood in the freezing rain, the pieces of the puzzle violently locking into place. Nathaniel George's pristine suit, his fake sympathy, the way he watched me from the tinted SUV across from the bank. He had manipulated the timeline, sending me to the vault just to see if I possessed the leverage, while simultaneously paying Donovan to erase me and the other liabilities at Street Jude's before the trust could be legally transferred to my name. We need to get to a hospital, I said, looking at the blood pouring from Richard's side. No hospitals, Richard groaned, sliding into the driver's seat. He looked back at Leo and Rachel, who were wide-eyed and terrified on the floorboards, and then up at me. George has the Portland police in his pocket. If we walk into an ER with gunshot wounds, we'll be dead before the doctor finishes the stitches. We have a safe house in the Pearl District, an old Sterling property that isn't on the books. I climbed into the passenger seat, slamming the door. The heater blasted to life as Richard turned the ignition, the old V8 engine roaring over the sound of the storm. So, what do we do? I asked, looking down at the leather ledger resting on my lap. The names of the corrupt, the powerful, and the guilty were all bound in these pages. My grandmother had spent her life hiding us from the wolves, but hiding had gotten my parents killed. Hiding had gotten Mrs. Gable shot. Richard shifted the truck into drive, his jaw set like granite. We run. We hide. We figure out how to survive the night. No, I said quietly. Richard paused, looking over at me. I ran my fingers over the embossed leather of the ledger. I was done being a victim. I was done being the forgotten orphan, the secret shame, the target. Beatrice Kensington's blood ran in my veins, and I was about to show Nathaniel George exactly what that meant. We don't hide, Richard, I said, my voice dropping to a deadly, resolute calm. George thinks I'm a scared little girl who grew up in the dirt. He thinks I'm going to run. I looked up, meeting my uncle's eyes. We aren't running. Tomorrow morning, we are going to take this ledger to Gallagher and Cohen, George's biggest rival firm. We are going to freeze his assets, go to the federal authorities, outside of his jurisdiction, and burn his entire empire to the ground. Richard stared at me for a long moment, the ghost of a proud smile touching his lips despite the pain. You are definitely your grandmother's granddaughter. He slammed his foot on the gas, and the truck tore out of the gravel driveway, leaving Street Jude's home for children and my old life in the rearview mirror forever. Rain hammered relentlessly against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the industrial loft in Portland's Pearl District. The safe house was a sprawling, aggressively modern space of exposed brick and cold steel, purchased years ago under one of Richard's many shell corporations. It felt less like a home and more like a fortress. The first hour was a blur of blood and adrenaline. Richard collapsed onto a leather sofa the moment I locked the heavy deadbolts behind us. His face was the color of ash. I had no medical training, but 18 years at Street. Jude's had taught me how to handle emergencies. I raided the loft's fully stocked trauma kit, sterilized a pair of forceps with a bottle of aged scotch I found in a crystal decanter, and managed to pack and dress the greys on his side. Once Richard was stabilized and breathing easier, I settled Leo and Rachel into the guest bedroom. They were exhausted, shivering, and traumatized. I wrapped them in thick down comforters, gave them hot tea, and sat at the edge of the bed until their eyes finally fluttered shut. When I returned to the main living area, the digital clock on the stove glowed in the dark. 3:14 a.m. Richard was awake, staring at the ceiling, nursing a glass of the scotch. I walked over to the sprawling marble kitchen island and dropped the heavy leather ledger onto the surface. The dull thud echoed in the cavernous room. "We have to bypass Portland entirely," I said, flipping the book open. "George owns the local judges. He owns the police commissioner. If we walk into a local precinct, that ledger disappears into an evidence locker, and we disappear into the Willamette River." Richard grimaced, shifting his weight. "You're thinking federal. I'm thinking Seattle," I corrected. I spent the last hour reading through my grandmother's notes in the margins. Beatrice didn't just record her own bribes. She recorded George's. She had a private intelligence firm tracking him for the last 5 years. He's been embezzling from the Kensington Trust and funneling it into offshore accounts to fund these mercenary groups. It's wire fraud, racketeering, and conspiracy to commit murder. I traced my finger down a column of names until I found the one I was looking for. Beatrice listed a contingency contact, an attorney named Thomas Gallagher, based out of Seattle, senior partner at Gallagher, Cohen, and Miller. Beatrice noted that Gallagher has a blood feud with George dating back 20 years over a corporate espionage case. If there is one man who would love to see Nathaniel George in handcuffs, it's him. Richard managed a weak, impressed chuckle. Gallagher is a shark, a federal prosecutor turned private litigator, but he won't take a meeting with a teenager and a dead man based on a phone call at 3 in the morning. "He will," I said coldly, "when I tell him I have the Kensington ledger." I grabbed the burner phone Richard had tossed on the counter and dialed the emergency after-hours number listed in the book. The line rang 3 times before a groggy, sharp voice answered. "This is Gallagher. State your emergency, or I'm billing you $1,000 for waking me up." "Mr. Gallagher, my name is Clara Hayes. I am Beatrice Kensington's granddaughter." There was a long, heavy pause on the other end of the line, the rustle of sheets. "Beatrice's heir is a ghost. The estate is locked in probate." "I have her ledger," I said, my voice steady, betraying none of the terror vibrating in my chest. "I have 50 years of financial records, proof of a black site orphanage, and a paper trail proving Nathaniel George just ordered a hit on me to steal the Kensington Trust. I am in Portland, and I need federal marshals. If you help me, I will give you the one thing you've wanted for 20 years. Nathaniel George's head, on a silver platter." Silence hung in the air for 10 agonizing seconds. "Miss Hayes," Gallagher finally said, his voice completely awake and vibrating with predatory anticipation. "Don't move. I'm calling the FBI field office in Seattle. We are taking a private jet. We will be in Portland by sunrise." Monday morning arrived with a deceptive calm. The storm had passed, leaving the Portland skyline washed clean and gleaming in the pale sunlight. Nathaniel George sat at the head of the massive mahogany table in the penthouse boardroom of George and Associates. The room smelled of expensive cologne and freshly printed legal documents. Surrounding him were 3 junior partners and a notary public. I knew this because Thomas Gallagher, stepping out of a black Suburban with 4 heavily armed federal agents, had handed me an earpiece connected to a surveillance bug his team had planted in the building hours earlier. "He's about to sign the dissolution papers," Gallagher murmured, adjusting his perfectly tailored navy suit. He was a silver-haired, imposing man who radiated raw legal power. He filed a petition at 8:00 a.m., claiming the sole heir is officially missing and presumed dead, triggering the default clause. "He thinks he's won. Let's go break his heart," I replied. I barely recognized myself in the reflection of the glass elevator doors as we ascended to the 50th floor. The combat boots and faded flannel were gone. Gallagher had sent an assistant to procure a sharp, tailored black suit. My hair was pulled back into a severe, sleek knot. I looked exactly like the woman who had abandoned me, Beatrice Kensington. The elevator doors chimed and slid open. The receptionist didn't even have time to pick up her phone before Special Agent Croft, the lead FBI agent, flashed his badge and bypassed the desk. We walked down the plush carpeted hallway. Through the frosted glass doors of the boardroom, I could see George standing up, pen in hand. Gallagher pushed the heavy double doors open. They hit the walls with a resounding crack. "I wouldn't sign that, Nathaniel," Gallagher announced, his voice booming through the silent room. "Unless you want to add perjury to your federal indictment." George froze. His head snapped up, his perfectly composed mask slipping for a fraction of a second as his eyes landed on Gallagher, the federal agents, and finally on me. He turned completely white. "Gallagher," George stammered, dropping the pen. "What is the meaning of this? This is a private, closed-door, legal proceeding." "Not anymore," I said. Stepping out from behind Gallagher's imposing shadow, I walked directly to the head of the table, making unbroken eye contact with the man who had ordered my murder. "Hello, Mr. George. You didn't really think a little rain and a couple of hired guns would keep me away from my inheritance, did you?" The junior partners murmured in confusion. George's jaw tightened. "Security! Get these people out of my building. This girl is an imposter." "Save your breath, Nathaniel," Gallagher sneered, tossing a thick, bound copy of the ledger onto the mahogany table. It hit the wood with a heavy thud. "We have the Kensington ledger. We have the wire transfers from your offshore accounts to a mercenary group known as Blackwood Security. We have the ballistics from the Orphanage. And we have Richard Sterling, alive and willing to testify." George stared at the copied ledger, his eyes wide with a mixture of disbelief and mounting panic. That is fabricated." Beatrice was paranoid. "She made things up. She made up the $10 million you wired to a man named Donovan exactly 48 hours ago," I asked, leaning over the table, my voice dropping to a lethal whisper. "The same Donovan who shot Harriet Gable? The FBI raided Blackwood's staging grounds an hour ago. Nathaniel. They found the burn phones. They found the money trail. It all leads back to this desk." Special Agent Croft stepped forward, pulling a pair of steel handcuffs from his belt. "Nathaniel George, you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, wire fraud, and violations of the RICO Act. You have the right to remain silent." As the agents moved in, grabbing George by the arms and forcing him against the glass wall to cuff him, the invincible corporate titan finally crumbled. He didn't yell. He didn't fight. He just stared at me, his eyes hollow, realizing that the empire he had killed for had just been ripped away by the very girl he threw away in the trash. "You're just like her," George hissed as they marched him toward the door. "You're just like Beatrice." "No," I replied, standing tall. Beatrice hid in the shadows. "I don't. Survival is a strange inheritance. I walked into that bank as Clara Hayes, the forgotten orphan, and walked out as the sole controlling shareholder of a $45 million empire. The federal investigation took months, tearing through Portland's corrupt elite like a hurricane. George was sentenced to life in a federal penitentiary, without the possibility of parole. But the money didn't matter. What mattered was the brass key. It didn't just unlock a deposit box filled with dark secrets. It unlocked my ability to dismantle the cage that had held so many innocent children captive. I legally adopted Leo and Rachel, ensuring they would never spend another night in fear. With Richard by my side, as my chief advisor, I liquidated Street, Jude's home for children, and used the Kensington Trust to build a genuine, fully transparent sanctuary and scholarship fund for the city's most vulnerable kids. We tore down the peeling wallpaper and the iron bars, replacing them with sunlight and actual hope. Blood might be thick enough to drown you, but I learned that the family you choose to build from the wreckage is the only thing that truly keeps you afloat.